Hi, I'm David. I'm here to tell you about the book of Exodus. So, does everybody know the Moses and the reeds and the basket story? Cool? We accept that part? Okay, great. Now, Moses is living in the palace in Egypt as he's growing up. When people get mad at him, people tend to call him a Hebrew. He doesn't really know what this word means at the time, but as he gets older, he begins to learn about who the Hebrews are in the Egyptian culture. Hebrews are, at this moment in time, slaves in Egypt. They work long hours of terrible work and are beaten to death if they don't meet standards, which are pretty harsh. Now, once Moses learns that he's not an Egyptian and is actually a Hebrew, he goes out and begins to learn about the Hebrew culture, and he meets his family members. As he's exploring more of the Hebrew culture, he sees a Hebrew getting beaten to death for whatever reason it was. This angers Moses so much that he ends up killing the man who is killing someone else and has to flee Egypt because he committed an act of murder, and if he's ever found in Egypt, it's not probably going to be too good for him. So he runs off to a small town outside of Egypt where he finds a well and takes a long swig of water because, it's a pretty long walk. As he's there, 7 sisters show up and begin to feed their livestock that they have with them. While they're there, another group of shepherds shows up and forcibly removes the sisters so that they can allow their livestock to drink, it's not feeding, from the well. Now, Moses sees this and is again angered. He goes up to the shepherds and gets rid of them so that way the sisters can come back and allow their livestock to drink from the well. Now, Moses gets rather close to one of these sisters, gets married to them, and has a child, and, gets a nice little life going in the small town near the Egyptian palace. Now, one day, a few years later, he's got a nice little life going. He's walking around outside of town when he finds a burning bush. Now, there are several things unique about said burning bush. One of them is that it is the only burning bush in this area of other things. If it was actually on fire, it should be spreading the fire to other things. And the bush itself is not burning. The fire is just on the bush. Okay, so Moses goes up to inspect said bush that is rather unique when he hears God speak to him, and he asks Moses to go back into Egypt to help lead the Hebrews out of Egypt. Now, of course, Moses is hesitant, having just seen a rather unique bush and being spoken to God in the same day, but he eventually comes to and heads back to Egypt, and on the way, he meets his brother and learns of how the old Pharaoh has died, the one who had taken Moses in, and a new Pharaoh has taken his place, who has increased the work that the Hebrews have to do, and they have to now create their own supplies to then build for the Pharaoh, and they have to meet old supply standards as well. And that's not going over too well with the Hebrews, as almost none of them are meeting this standard. Now, when Moses arrives in Egypt, he gathers the Hebrews and he leads them to the Pharaoh to demand their freedom, saying that God has charged them for him to lead the Hebrews out of Egypt. The Pharaoh does not take this very kindly and tells them to leave his palace and get back to work. And the Pharaoh also increases the amount of work that they have to do because they dare challenge him and ask for their freedom. Now, all of the Hebrews are distraught, having just met Moses again after several years, and this first strategy failing. So they all turn to God, and God, over the next several weeks or so, performs many miracles, the most important of which we know as Passover. This is when the Hebrews each killed a lamb and had a meal with it, put the blood of the lamb over their door, and went to sleep. And overnight, nothing happened for the Hebrews because they did this. The Egyptians, on the other hand, the firstborn son of every family died, including the Pharaohs. Now, after this, the Pharaoh was distraught and allowed the Hebrews to leave. but they didn't get to take anything really. Like, they were making bread and they couldn't take the bread. It's a whole thing. Anyway, after a couple days of traveling, they're staying by the Red Sea when on the horizon they see an army approaching. This is the Pharaoh's army because after a couple days, he changed his mind and wanted his slaves back. So Moses begins to pray to God to ask for a way around the sea because they've been staying there for several days trying to figure out how to cross the sea because they don't have any supplies to build a boat to get across. So Moses reaches up to God and asks for help, and God gives Moses the ability to part the Red Sea. So they all hurry across, and somehow they manage to get all the way across the ocean and then also drown the Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. It's a pretty good day for them. So over the next 40 years or so, they end up traveling to the Promised Land, but having not had time to prepare any sort of resources, they don't have any food. So Moses, again, prays to God and asks for help in any sort of way he can. And the first thing God does is sends birds for them to kill and hunt and get food from, which is a pretty good start. And not only that, he gives them manna, which is another resource that allows them to thrive, basically, on the road to the Promised Land. Now, having not been able to prepare resources, they also don't have any water. So Moses, again, prays to God and asks for help in creating fresh water for the Hebrews. And God tells him to hit a special rock with his walking stick, which Moses promptly does, and water begins to come from the rock and allows the Hebrews to have fresh water. Thank you.
Okay, our next story comes from the 8th chapter of Luke's Gospel.
One day in Galilee, Jesus and his disciples decided to cross a lake, so they got into a boat. When they reached the middle of the lake, a storm started to come. The waves started to get really big, and the wind started to get really strong. And Jesus fell asleep in the storm. And the disciples were worried, and they didn't know what to do. And they said, "We're going to drown. What are we going to do? We're going to drown." Jesus was still sleeping. "We're going to drown. What are we going to do? We're going to drown." And Jesus was still sleeping. "We're going to drown. What are we going to do? We're going to drown." Jesus was still sleeping. The disciples woke Jesus up and they said, Teacher, we're going to drown. What are we going to do?" And Jesus stood up and he told the wind and the waves to stop. And they did. And the disciples asked, "Who are you? Even the wind and the waves obey you. Who are you?" And Jesus said, "Why were you afraid? Don't you have any faith?" And the disciples were confused, and they kept saying, "Who are you? Who are you?"
The next story is told in several Gospels. Today it will be told from the Gospel of Luke.
The story that I would like to tell you is one that I have loved for a long, long time. I heard it first as a child in Sunday school, and it made a big impression on me. And I have loved to tell it to my grandchildren and have thought about it many times through the years. There was a man who was paralyzed. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know if he was born that way, if he had an accident, or if he had some kind of illness that caused it. But obviously he had been suffering for a long, long time. He did everything he knew to do to help himself. He went to what doctors he could find. He tried herbs that people told him about. He did every single thing that he could think of to no avail. He was still paralyzed. One day, when he was in his bed, he heard a lot of traffic outside his room window in the street. People were very excited. They were talking about a man named Jesus who was coming to a town nearby. And the man that was paralyzed began to think, oh, if I could just get to Jesus, I have faith. I know he could heal me. But how in the world can I, as a paralyzed man, get to Jesus? Now comes on the scene 4 good friends. They came to visit from time to time. And they came that next day to talk to the man. And they began to think, what in the world can we do? How can we work out a situation to get him to the next town, which is not that far, but as you remember, there's no vehicles. We've got to come up with a way to work this out. So they decided that they would make a bed, a gurney, a pallet, whatever, with 2 long rods, one on each side, 2 long poles, where each friend could carry one to transport this man to the town where Jesus was. So they got it all ready. The next morning, they got it very, very early. Started out right after sunup. It was hot. The road was dusty. There were a lot of people on the road. Obviously, a lot of people were trying to get to the town where Jesus was. They had to stop from time to time because they needed to drink water. They needed to rest. And finally, they got to the town where Jesus was. He was in a house, speaking, preaching, and healing. But alas, when they got to the house, the crowd was enormous. You can imagine, the house was already full. People were hanging in the windows. Adults had children on their shoulders. Around the door, you could not even see where the door was. It was so crowded. So they had to come up with another plan. They were not going to give up at this point. So they secured some strong ropes, took the man on the pallet around to the back of the house where there was a set of steps that went upstairs to the roof. And somehow they were able to get that man on the pallet up to the roof after a lot of hard work. And then they realized that they had another problem facing them. That roof was made of tile. So they were going to have to manually remove enough tiles to make the hole large enough to lower the man with ropes down into the room where Jesus was. After much work, they were able to do it. And so they began to lower the man with ropes, and they laid him right at Jesus' feet. The people in the room were astonished. They had been watching the whole process, and so had Jesus. So the man was right on the floor in front of Jesus. And Jesus looked at him, and he said, "Your sins are forgiven. Rise up, take your bed, and go home." The man stepped off his pallet, stood up straight as an arrow, smiled at Jesus, rolled his pallet up, and walked out the door, glorifying God. Now, God does help people help themselves, but sometimes he uses us as an instrument to help people who cannot help themselves. When I look around this congregation, I see so many people through the years who have been instruments of God. So many things you all have done, and we as a congregation have done. Some have been small gestures by individuals. Some have been huge projects by our entire congregation. So oftentimes we are used as instruments of God to bring about the cause when someone cannot help themselves.
Next story. Comes from 1 Kings. Jim, your turn.
My story is from the Old Testament, and I like Old Testament stories. I like the way they talk. And so I'm going to kind of read a little bit of it, and then talk a little bit about it, and then read a little bit. to begin with, to set the stage, there's 4 people in this story: God, Elijah, a prophet, a woman who has no name, and Ahab, the king. Evidently, God is not happy with Ahab, and he sends Elijah to tell him that there's going to be a drought, okay? And so I'll pick up all right, so Elijah is standing before Ahab, and he said, as the Lord God lives before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word, God's word, all right? And so as soon as he said that, as soon as he told the king that, God knew that Elijah was going to be in trouble. So he says, and then the word of the Lord came to him, depart from here and turn eastward. He's talking to Elijah. And hide yourself by the brook Cherith that is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So basically, what I'm getting is God knows he's in trouble, so he's putting him in a witness protection program down by the river, and he's got drones bringing him food, Grubhub, ravens, man. And so I'm thinking about all that, and it goes on to say, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening. And I'm thinking, man, this guy's got it made. You know, there's a drought going on. And just about at the time I'm kind of enjoying all this, you know, the birds and all that kind of stuff. Here it goes, it says, and after a while the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. Well, golly, I guess I should have seen that one coming, but I didn't, you know, because I was still with the birds and all that food and all. Anyway, okay, so now the word of the Lord came to him again. And it says, arise, he's talking to Elijah again, and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Okay, God says, behold, I like the way God talks, behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. And so you would think, I mean, and it says here that, all right, wait a second. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And so I'm thinking, okay, if I'm Elijah, I'm going to this town, and God's told me that he's got a woman there going to feed me, even though it's a drought. You know, I'm Gucci, I'm good. Everything's going to be good. And you would think that God had talked to this woman too. I have commanded a woman there to feed you. So you would think that when he gets there, this woman knows what's going on. Okay, well, let's kind of fast forward here. All right, so he rolls up onto Zarephath, okay? And when he gets there, sure enough, he sees a woman, a widow woman outside gathering sticks, okay? And so he figures, this is my girl right here. So he walks up to her and he says, you know, I like to have something to drink. It's been a hard trip, you know. And now this woman, when he says, I want to get something to drink, she starts off to get him something to drink, okay? And then, only then, he says to her, can you spare something to eat too while you're at it? And the woman kind of stops. And here I'm going to stop the story a minute and talk about this woman who is cool. This woman is cool. I don't think God told her that Elijah was coming. You know, it says here that he commanded a woman, but it doesn't sound like she knew he was coming. Because when he came and he said, how about give me something to drink? I mean, she didn't say, hey, what's up? How you doing? Where you been? You know? I mean, she did, you know, what he told her to do. Now this woman, you know, remember it's a drought. It's drought. It's bad. Dry. And this woman, to kind of jump ahead of the story, she was down to nothing. I mean, she didn't have anything. It was her and her son, and they were down basically to their last meal. And so she had gone outside the gates to pick up sticks to go make a fire to bake one little loaf of bread. And then after that, that was it. They didn't have anything left. Okay, so she's out there picking sticks, and he comes up to her and he says, where am I? All right, bring me a little water and bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. Now, the woman, there was a lot of things that she could have done right there, you know. she's bending over picking up sticks, and her and her child are going to die, and he's asking her for something to drink. And as she was going to bring it, I mean, that's an important line to me. He said, go get me something to drink. And she just got up, and as she was going to get it, I mean, it didn't say like, and after he ducked a handful of sticks and an ear full of cussing, she told him, I can't do it. She goes and does it. And I love this woman. She doesn't have a name, but I love her. And so she goes off and she says, I would love to give you something to drink. I'd like to give you something to eat, but I have nothing, man. I'm gathering a couple sticks that I can go in and prepare a meal for myself and my son, that we are going to eat it and die. I mean, that's how bad it was. They're going to eat this and die. And Elijah basically says to her, look, do that, but just save a small amount for me. And if you will do that, then the jar, what little bit of flour you have, what little bit of oil you have, shall never be spent. It will always be there. And she went and did as Elijah had said. She just went and did it. And sure enough, the household ate from there on until the rain came. And I thought about that, and I thought, now, this woman went and did what she said, what Elijah said. And I don't see where she was really helping herself much, but it was more, in her case, I think it was more of a situation where, I mean, she had just gotten to the end. She was going to die, her son was going to die, but still, her belief in God and doing what the prophet Elijah said was still unfailing. I mean, she was still eager or willing to do what she needed to do. And so I think it's more of a story where in her weakness, at her weakest point, is where she found her strength by going and doing what Elijah and God had told her to do. And, from that point on, when she did that, like the book said, that she always had enough flour and she always had enough oil to last until the rains came.
You've never heard those stories told exactly.